The blue light of the police cruiser cuts through the Seoul rain, rhythmic and blinding. It bounces off the hood of the dented taxi, turning the falling water into shards of electric glass. Inside, the air is thick with the smell of damp upholstery and ozone. Samuel grips the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the dark leather. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. A black sedan swerves into the mouth of the alley, tires screeching against the slick asphalt, blocking the only path forward. Samuel slams the gear into reverse, the engine whining in protest as he tries to find a gap, a way out, anything. The car shudders, tires spinning uselessly against the wet ground, failing to find traction. He shifts again, his jaw set, eyes darting from the rearview mirror to the windshield. The police lights pulse, closer now, painting the interior of the taxi in alternating flashes of cold blue and warning red. He knows this street. He knows there is no other turn. The engine revs, a desperate mechanical roar that dies against the sound of the downpour. He is trapped, and the silence between the flashes of light is the loudest thing in the world. Beside him, the passenger door rattles as the rain hammers against the glass. Ji-yoon is curled into the corner of the seat, her breathing shallow and jagged. She does not look at the police lights. She stares straight ahead, her eyes wide, reflecting the frantic pulse of the city outside. Her hands tremble as she pulls her knees toward her chest, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the shadows of the cabin. She flinches every time a siren wails, her head snapping toward the window, then back to the dashboard. She is shivering, not from the cold, but from the raw, vibrating terror that fills the small space between them. Samuel glances at her, seeing the way she presses her palms against her ears, blocking out the world. She is a statue of panic, frozen in the center of a storm. The sedan outside edges closer, its headlights blinding, turning the interior into a cage of harsh, white glare. Ji-yoon lets out a sharp, stifled gasp. Samuel shifts his weight, his eyes locking onto the rearview mirror, watching the men emerge from the sedan. The alley is shrinking. There is nowhere left to run. The rain against the windshield fades, replaced by the memory of a different kind of pressure. 3 years ago, Samuel stepped off the plane with a portfolio tucked under his arm and a vision of Seoul's skyline etched into his mind. He saw buildings as puzzles, structures that could house dreams and define the future. He walked the streets with his head tilted upward, tracing the lines of steel and glass, convinced he would be the one to draw the next horizon. But the city did not offer a drafting table. It offered a driver's seat. The transition was not a single moment, but a slow erosion of intent. The architecture degree remained in a folder beneath his bed, gathering dust, while the taximeter became his new clock. He traded the precision of a ruler for the chaotic rhythm of late-night traffic. Every shift meant navigating the same labyrinthine veins of the city, learning the shortcuts that the GPS ignored. He became a ghost in his own life, a man who knew every corner of the metropolis, but was never invited to step inside. The dream of designing spaces shifted into the reality of surviving them. His home was a 4-meter square box in Gwanak-gu, tucked into a basement level where the sun never reached the floorboards. The walls were thin, papered dry partitions that offered no sanctuary from the life of the building. Every night, the neighbor's television broadcasted the same aggressive game shows and weeping dramas, the sound vibrating through the headboard of his bed. He could hear the clatter of dishes in the unit above and the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps in the hallway. Samuel sat on the edge of his mattress, staring at the damp patch spreading across the corner of the ceiling. He kept his architecture tools in a plastic bin under the sink, the metal rulers cold to the touch. He rarely opened them. The city outside roared with a life he could hear but never touch. He would press his ear against the wall, listening to the muffled laughter of families or the arguments of couples, a ghost haunting a structure he had no part in. He was a man surrounded by millions, yet the silence in his room was absolute. He stood up, paced the length of the floor 3 times, and sat back down. The city was a machine, and he was a gear that did not fit. The hotel entrance was a wall of polished glass and blinding white light. Samuel pulled the taxi to the curb, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. He checked the meter, the numbers glowing in the dim cabin, and waited for the next fare. The street was quiet, save for the rhythmic pulse of the hotel's revolving doors. Then, the silence broke. The rear door of the taxi flew open, hitting the side of the car with a sharp metallic clang. A figure lunged into the back seat, the movement sudden and desperate. The door slammed shut before Samuel could even turn his head. He looked into the rearview mirror. The passenger was already leaning forward, her hands pressed against the back of his seat, her breathing ragged and loud. She did not look at the hotel entrance. She looked at the street ahead, her eyes darting between the side mirrors. She gripped the leather headrest, her knuckles pressed hard. Samuel shifted the car into gear, his hand hovering over the lever. She leaned toward the partition, her voice low and tight. She said, "Drive." Samuel did not hesitate. He pressed the accelerator, and the taxi pulled away from the curb, merging into the dark flow of the city traffic. Samuel kept his eyes on the road, but his peripheral vision remained locked on the rearview mirror. The passenger was curled into the corner of the seat, her body rigid. As the taxi passed under the orange glow of a street lamp, the light hit her wrists. Samuel saw the dark, mottled bruises circling the skin, stark against her pale arms. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. She did not look at him. She did not look at the city rushing past the windows. Instead, she clutched her handbag to her chest with both hands, her fingers digging into the leather. It was a white-knuckled hold, the way someone clings to a life raft in a storm. She treated the bag not as an accessory, but as a shield against the world outside. Samuel opened his mouth to ask for a destination, to break the suffocating quiet, but the words died in his throat. The tension in the car was a physical weight. He did not ask for an address. He did not ask for a name. He simply kept his eyes forward, navigating the labyrinthine streets. The neon signs of Gangnam blurred into long, jagged streaks of red and yellow against the rain-slicked glass. Samuel wove through the late-night traffic, his eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the mirror. He slowed down, hoping to let the flow of cars swallow his taxi, but a black sedan behind him mirrored every move. When Samuel shifted lanes, the sedan followed. When he accelerated, the sedan surged forward, closing the distance with mechanical efficiency. The gap between them shrank. Samuel felt the vibration of the sedan's engine through the floorboards of his own car. He gripped the steering wheel, his arms locked, feeling the weight of the vehicle as he pushed it harder. The sedan did not try to pass. Samuel took a sharp turn into a side street, tires protesting against the wet asphalt, but the sedan swung around the corner just seconds later. Samuel pressed his foot down, the engine whining in protest, as the sedan lunged forward again, its headlights flooding the interior. The alleyway narrowed, the brick walls on either side closing in like a vice. Samuel saw the path ahead vanish into a wall of darkness. He tapped the brakes, preparing to turn, but the black sedan surged from a side opening, skidding sideways to block the only exit. The sedan's tires kicked up a spray of oily water against the taxi's door. Samuel slammed the gear shift into reverse. The engine roared, a guttural, desperate sound that echoed off the damp concrete. He floored the pedal. The taxi's rear tires spun, searching for grip on the slick pavement, before catching with a violent jerk. The car lurched backward, rubber burning against the wet ground. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes fixed on the gap between the sedan and the wall, calculating the inches. The sedan driver revved their engine, a low, threatening growl that vibrated through the taxi's chassis. Samuel twisted the steering wheel hard. He shifted again, the transmission clunking, and pushed the taxi into a tight, desperate arc, trying to find a way out of the suffocating space. The taxi skidded across the final stretch of gravel, its front bumper slamming into a concrete barrier near the Han River. The engine sputtered once and died, leaving the cabin in a sudden, ringing silence. Outside, the black sedan pulled to a halt, its headlights cutting through the mist like twin blades. Samuel felt the vibration of the sedan's engine through the floor. He knew the road ended here. He reached under his seat, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy iron of a wrench. The metal felt solid, grounding him against the panic rising in the car. He looked at the passenger seat, then back at the sedan. The doors of the pursuer's vehicle began to open. Samuel didn't hesitate. He pushed his door wide, the metal frame groaning as he stepped out onto the wet, uneven ground. He moved with deliberate, heavy steps, positioning himself squarely between his taxi and the men emerging from the sedan. The men from the sedan fanned out, their boots crunching on the gravel. They shouted commands, harsh and jagged, but Samuel did not understand the words. He did not need to. He planted his weight deeper into the mud, his center of gravity low and immovable. He held the iron wrench at his side, not swinging it, simply letting the weight of it speak for his intent. One man stepped forward, raising a hand to shove him aside, but Samuel didn't retreat. He stepped into the man's space, his chest broad and unyielding. The man recoiled, surprised by the lack of fear. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick with the smell of river water and exhaust. Samuel's breathing was slow, rhythmic. He shifted his gaze from one man to the next, his eyes locked on their hands, watching for the reach of a weapon. They hesitated. He was a wall of muscle and resolve, a barrier that refused to bend. He remained perfectly still, a silent iron sentinel between the danger and the car. A high-pitched wail pierced the heavy air, growing louder with every passing second. The men facing Samuel froze. Blue and red light began to bleed across the wet pavement, reflecting off the river and the surrounding concrete. Realizing the window for their attack had slammed shut, the men scrambled back toward their sedan. Tires screeched against the gravel as they spun the vehicle around, disappearing into the darkness before the patrol car even rounded the corner. Samuel lowered the wrench, his muscles finally beginning to tremble from the adrenaline drain. Officers swarmed the scene. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. News cameras crowded the streets, and people pointed at Samuel as he walked to his taxi. He was the man who stood his ground, the stranger who saved a life when no one else would. For 24 hours, the city celebrated him, but the warmth of the praise was deceptive. As the news cycle turned, the questions became sharper, and the tone of the headlines shifted. The shift happened in the span of a single afternoon. It started with a whisper on social media, then a crawl at the bottom of the news screen. The narrative that had painted Samuel as a savior began to warp, twisted by unseen hands into something unrecognizable. Headlines appeared, bold and accusatory, claiming the rescue was a staged performance. They called it a kidnapping. They claimed he had held the actress captive for a massive ransom, using the chaos of the night to hide his true intentions. The footage of him standing in the alley was replayed, but the context was stripped away. Every frame was analyzed by commentators. The public, once eager to celebrate, turned their backs with terrifying speed. Phones buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't answer. He watched from the window of his apartment as the city outside changed its face. The man who had been a hero at dawn was now the villain of the evening. The accusations were specific, calculated, and relentless. He was no longer a taxi driver. He was a target. The final blow arrived via a registered letter. Samuel tore open the envelope, his fingers shaking, to find the official notice of his taxi license revocation. It was immediate, permanent, and cited the ongoing investigation as the sole cause. He stared at the document, the ink blurring against the cheap paper. His livelihood, the only thing that kept him tethered to the city, was gone. He walked to the window and looked down at the street where his taxi had sat for 3 years. It was empty. The space felt hollow, a void where his identity used to be. He retreated to the small television in the corner of his room and clicked it on. The volume was low, but the images were inescapable. There was his face, frozen in a grainy security still, framed by the words, "Kidnapping suspect" in bold red text. The news anchor spoke with a clinical, detached tone, detailing the fabricated timeline of his supposed crimes. Samuel sat on the edge of his bed, the room feeling smaller with every passing minute. He was a ghost in his own home, a man erased by a screen. Outside, the city lights flickered, indifferent to the man watching his life collapse in the dark. The silence in the studio was absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Samuel sat in the dark, his eyes fixed on the door, expecting the police to arrive at any second. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch toward him, a physical manifestation of the walls closing in. Then, the sound came. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the wood. It was not the heavy, authoritative thud of law enforcement. It was hesitant, almost fragile. Samuel stood, his muscles coiled, and moved to the side of the door. He peered through the peephole, but the hallway light was dim, offering nothing but a blurred silhouette. He gripped the deadbolt, his heart hammering against his ribs, and turned the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a figure huddled in the shadows of the landing. She reached up, pulling back a thick scarf and removing a low-brimmed cap. The face was unmistakable, even in the gloom. Ji-eun stood there, her breath shallow, her gaze locked onto his with a raw, desperate intensity. There was no pretense left. Her eyes were red-rimmed, filled with a silent, heavy apology. She took a half-step forward, and Samuel stepped back, leaving the door wide open to the night. Samuel pulled the door shut and engaged the deadbolt, the sound echoing like a finality. The studio, once a place of solitary rest, became a fortress of shadows. They moved with deliberate care, avoiding the floorboards that groaned underfoot. Ji-eun stayed away from the windows, keeping to the corners where the light from the street could not reach her. They established a rhythm dictated by necessity. When the neighbor's television blared through the thin walls, they stopped talking, sitting frozen in the dark. They shared instant noodles heated on a single burner, the steam rising in the cold air as the only sign of life. Samuel watched her, noting how she flinched at the sound of sirens passing on the main road. He became her eyes, peering through the crack in the curtains. She became his anchor, her presence grounding him in a world that had tried to erase his existence. They were two outcasts, huddled together. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware that the two people it sought were breathing just inches away, hidden in the silence. The silence finally broke when Ji-eun placed her phone on the small table between them. She tapped the screen, scrolling through pages of dense legal text that glowed against her pale skin. She pointed to a signature line, her finger trembling. It was not just a contract, it was a cage. She explained how the agency had systematically manufactured debt, charging her for every meal, every garment, and every hour of studio time until she owed them more than she could ever earn. They owned her image, her name, and her future. If she stopped working, the penalties would trigger lawsuits that would bury her for a lifetime. She described the meetings in windowless rooms where executives dictated her every move, treating her like a piece of inventory rather than a person. She had tried to walk away once, but they had threatened to destroy her family's reputation, holding her past over her head like a blade. Samuel watched the screen, the cold light illuminating the depth of the trap she had been living in, realizing that their fight was not against a person, but against a system. The heavy atmosphere of the legal documents faded as Samuel turned his attention to the small stove. He boiled water for another round of noodles, the familiar scent of spice filling the cramped room. To break the suffocating tension, he spoke first, his voice low and steady. He described the heat of Lagos, the way the sun baked the red earth until it cracked, and the sound of the ocean crashing against the shore. Ji-eun listened, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from the bowl. When he finished, she began to speak of Jeju. She described the black volcanic rocks lining the coast and the biting, salt-heavy wind that swept across the island. As they traded these fragments of their pasts, the walls of the studio seemed to recede. They built a bridge across their shared isolation, finding a brief, fragile sense of home within the wreckage. The studio became a world unto itself, defined by the thin walls and the hum of the city outside. They developed a rhythm to their days, a silent choreography of survival. Samuel took the floor, leaving the narrow bed for Ji-eun, and spent his hours reinforcing the window latches with duct tape and cardboard. He checked the door lock every evening, testing the bolt until the metal clicked firmly into place. It was a small, repetitive action, but it was the only way he knew to build a perimeter against the world that wanted to reclaim her. Ji-eun began to help, organizing their limited supplies and keeping the lights dimmed to avoid drawing attention from the neighbors. She learned to move without making a sound, her movements deliberate and quiet. When the sirens wailed in the distance, they would look at each other, not with panic, but with a steady, unspoken agreement to remain still until the noise faded. They were two ghosts living in the cracks of the city, bound by the necessity of their mutual safety. In this cramped, windowless space, Samuel became more than a driver. He was the wall between her and the agency. He watched over her sleep, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. Miles away, in a sterile office bathed in the harsh glow of monitors, the search for Ji-yoon had never stopped. A data analyst scrolled through thousands of lines of encrypted transit logs, looking for a single anomaly. He paused. A dormant GPS signal from a decommissioned taxi flickered on his screen. It was a ghost file, buried deep. The analyst zoomed in, overlaying the coordinates against recent utility spikes in the area. The pattern was unmistakable. He cross-referenced the taxi's last known location with the registration of the studio building. A red box appeared on his screen. The agency did not need to guess anymore. They had the address. A team of 4 men stood up from their desks. Every second Samuel and Ji-yoon spent in their sanctuary was now being counted down by the men navigating the rain-slicked streets. The agency had found the thread, and they were pulling it tight, unaware that their target was waiting in the silence. The evening air in the studio was heavy, stagnant with the scent of damp concrete. Samuel sat on the floor, sharpening a small kitchen knife against a stone, his eyes fixed on the door. Ji-yoon was curled in the corner, her gaze locked on the flickering light of a single bulb. Then, the silence of the hallway shattered. A heavy, rhythmic thud of boots echoed against the thin walls, vibrating through the floorboards. Samuel froze, the knife held rigid in his hand. He signaled for Ji-yoon to stay low. The footsteps stopped directly outside their door. There was no hesitation, no attempt to knock or announce a presence. A heavy shoulder slammed against the wood, the frame groaning under the sudden, brutal force. The metal bolt rattled, the screws biting deep into the rotting door jamb. Another impact followed, louder this time, sending dust raining down from the ceiling. Samuel stood, his muscles coiled, watching the door shudder as the lock began to buckle. He knew the wood would not hold for more than a few seconds. The sanctuary was gone. The hunt had reached its end, and the space between them and the hallway was vanishing with every violent strike against the frame. The final blow arrived with the sound of splintering timber. The door frame surrendered, the wood snapping like dry bone as the barrier swung inward. Samuel did not retreat. He lunged forward, grabbing Ji-yoon by the arm and pulling her toward the small, tiled bathroom. He shoved her inside, her heels skidding on the floor, and slammed the door shut. He threw the deadbolt, the metal clicking into place with a sharp final sound. He turned back to the main room, his chest heaving. The hallway was now a gaping hole. 3 men stood in the threshold, their silhouettes framed by the dim light of the corridor. They moved into the room with practiced, predatory grace, eyes scanning the small space. Samuel planted his feet, widening his stance to block their path to the bathroom. He felt the cold air from the hallway rush in, smelling of rain and stale smoke. He raised his fists, his knuckles raw, and stared them down. The men stopped, assessing the resistance. Samuel didn't blink. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as the confrontation turned into a desperate, singular stand. The first man lunged, a heavy fist connecting with Samuel's jaw. The impact sent a jolt of white-hot pain through his skull, but he didn't fall. He spat blood onto the floor and stepped into the man's guard, driving a shoulder into his chest. Then the others closed in. A boot caught him in the ribs, the force knocking the wind from his lungs. He gasped, his vision blurring, yet he pivoted to keep his back firmly against the bathroom door. Every strike was a calculated effort to break his resolve. A fist slammed into his temple, and he felt the floor tilt beneath him. He grabbed the edge of a wooden shelf to steady himself, his fingers slipping on the surface. His gray hoodie was darkening, soaked through with blood from a split lip and a bruised cheek. They kicked his legs, trying to force him to his knees, but he hooked his arms around a radiator pipe, anchoring himself in place. He was a wall of muscle and sheer stubbornness. Each blow landed with sickening thuds, yet he didn't scream. He only stared at them, his eyes fixed and unyielding, refusing to let them pass. He was breaking, but he was holding the line. The men paused, sensing the shift in the room. They had Samuel pinned against the radiator, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. One attacker raised a heavy boot, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. Then, the bathroom door behind Samuel clicked, the sound cut through the violence like a sharp blade. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the movement. Ji-yoon stepped out. She was not trembling. She was not hiding. She held her phone steady, the screen glowing with the red light of an active recording. She moved into the center of the room, her gaze locked onto the men's faces, capturing every detail of their aggression. She didn't say a word. She simply held the device up, a mirror reflecting their brutality back at them. The lead attacker's hand dropped. He looked at the lens, then at the screen, his confidence shattering in real time. Samuel slumped against the wall, his chest rising and falling, watching as the hunters realized they had become the prey. The lead attacker lunged for the phone, his fingers clawing at the air, but he stopped short. A low, rhythmic pulse of blue and red light began to sweep across the studio walls. Outside, the wail of sirens grew from a distant hum to a deafening roar. The men scrambled, their faces pale, looking toward the door. They were no longer the hunters. They were cornered rats. Samuel pushed himself off the wall, his legs shaking, and blocked the only exit. The heavy thud of boots hit the hallway floor. The door, already hanging off its hinges, was kicked wide open. Uniformed officers flooded the room, weapons drawn. They saw the scene in a single, frozen second. The three men huddled near the center of the studio, their hands raised in panicked surrender, and Samuel, standing firm in front of the bathroom. The lead officer scanned the room, his gaze resting on the phone Ji-eun still held high. The nightmare was over. The officers cleared the room, but Ji-eun remained motionless in the corner. Her thumb hovered over the screen, her eyes fixed on the progress bar of a file upload. The world outside the studio was still spinning, but inside, the digital tide was turning. She hit the final button. The video, raw and undeniable, surged into the public domain. It bypassed every gatekeeper and every contract, landing directly in the feeds of millions. Within seconds, the first notifications began to ping. Then came the vibration of 1,000 alerts, a rhythmic hum that filled the quiet space. The footage spread across the city, then the country, like a wildfire in the night. Every billboard, every news screen, and every social media timeline suddenly flickered with the same image. The agency men cornered in the studio. The false narrative of the kidnapping dissolved into nothingness. Comments flooded in, shifting from accusations to shock, then to outrage against the agency. Samuel watched the screen as his own name was scrubbed clean. The digital wall had fallen, and the air in the room felt light, clear, and entirely their own. The fallout was instantaneous. By dawn, the agency's main office was surrounded by news vans and shouting crowds. Inside, the atmosphere was frantic. Phones rang off the hook, but no one answered. The legal team, usually so composed, scrambled to shred documents as investigators from the district attorney's office pushed past the reception desk. They carried boxes, seizing servers and hard drives that held the secrets of 100 broken lives. The agency's CEO, once untouchable, was seen being escorted through the back exit, his face shielded by a folder. Outside, workers began peeling the agency's logo off the glass facade, the adhesive screeching against the metal. By midday, the agency was officially shuttered, its assets frozen, and its power over its talent completely severed. Ji-eun watched the live feed from the hospital waiting room, her hands finally still. The invisible chains were gone. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and rain. Outside the window, the city of Seoul continued its relentless pace, but inside, time had slowed to a crawl. Samuel lay still, his breathing steady, the rhythmic pulse of the monitor the only sound in the room. Ji-eun sat in the plastic chair beside the bed, her gaze fixed on the slow rise and fall of his chest. She did not look at her phone. She did not look at the news. She watched the way the light shifted across his face, noting the small, jagged mark on his brow that had been there since the night they met. When Samuel finally stirred, His eyes fluttered open, searching the room with a lingering reflexive instinct for danger. He saw her, and the tension in his shoulders broke. He tried to sit up, a sharp wince crossing his face, but Ji-yoon reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a soft, firm weight that kept him grounded. She simply held his gaze, her expression clear and unburdened for the first time in years. In that silence, the frantic energy of the chase finally evaporated. Back in the cramped studio in Gwangju, the air felt different. The walls were still thin, and the city noise still filtered through the window, but the suffocating weight of the past had lifted. Samuel moved to the corner of the room where his belongings had sat untouched for months. He pulled a heavy, dust-coated box from beneath the bed frame. Inside, he found his old drafting compass, a set of fine-point pens, and a stack of vellum paper yellowed at the edges. He spread the sheets across the small, scarred wooden table. These were the designs he had abandoned 3 years ago, sketches of structures that prioritized light, open space, and safety. He picked up a pencil, the weight of it familiar and grounding in his hand. He began to trace a line, then another, refining the curve of a support beam. The ink flowed with a new, deliberate precision. For the first time since arriving in the city, the vision of a building he could actually construct felt less like a dream and more like a blueprint. He looked at the empty space on the paper and saw not just a structure, but a foundation for a life he had once feared was lost forever. The silence of the apartment was no longer lonely. It was a workspace waiting for his next move. Across town, Ji-yoon sat at a small desk, the glow of her laptop illuminating a stack of legal documents. Her agency had sent another courier, a final attempt to lure her back with promises of a comeback tour and a massive contract renewal. She read the clauses, the restrictive travel, the mandated public appearances, the total loss of autonomy, and felt nothing but a cold, distant clarity. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the curated feed of her former life. Thousands of comments, millions of likes, and a constant suffocating demand for her attention. With a steady hand, she opened the settings and tapped delete on every account. The screen went dark. She turned to the window, watching the neon pulse of Gangnam in the distance. It looked like a stage set, artificial and hollow. She picked up a pair of scissors and shredded the contract, the paper falling like snow onto the floor. She stood up, gathered her few personal belongings, and walked toward the door. Behind her, the apartment remained silent. The burner phone on Samuel's desk vibrated, a sharp, metallic sound against the quiet of the studio. He picked it up, recognizing the sequence of numbers immediately. Ji-yoon was on the other end, her voice steady. They spoke for only a few minutes. The conversation focused on logistics, yet heavy with the weight of their shared history. Samuel suggested the old industrial building near the river, the one he had once sketched during his early, lonely days in Seoul. It was a site of cold concrete and rusted iron, a place where the city had tried to break them both, yet failed. Ji-yoon agreed without hesitation. They planned the time for the following dawn, just as the first light would hit the skyline. As the call ended, Samuel looked out his window at the sprawling gray cityscape. The meeting wasn't just a goodbye. He set his drafting tools aside and began to pack a small bag, his movements deliberate and calm. He was finally ready. The rooftop air was thin and bit at the skin, carrying the scent of damp concrete and the distant rising hum of the city. Samuel reached the edge first, his boots scuffing against the gravel. He stood still, hands deep in his pockets, watching the horizon. A few minutes later, the heavy metal door groaned open. Ji-yoon stepped out, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked to the ledge, stopping inches from him. Below, Seoul was a vast, sprawling grid of shadows, but the darkness was already thinning. A sliver of pale light appeared in the east, bleeding across the skyline. The Seoul Tower stood stark against the fading stars. They did not speak. The silence was heavy, not with tension, but with the weight of everything they had survived. As the sun finally crested the horizon, a sudden warm glow washed over the rooftop, turning the gray concrete into a sea of gold. The light hit their faces, steady and bright, as the long night finally retreated. They stood at the edge of the city, watching the dawn reclaim the skyline. The golden light deepened, turning the rooftop into a quiet island above the waking city. Samuel turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. There was no need for explanations or apologies. The months of hiding, the fear, and the relentless pursuit had stripped away everything superficial, leaving only the raw truth of their survival. Ji-eun stood perfectly still, her eyes reflecting the rising sun. She tilted her head, a small, almost imperceptible nod that acknowledged the secret they now held alone. It was a language of shared history, etched into the way they stood against the wind. Below them, the traffic began to pulse, a rhythmic hum of a city that had once been their cage, now just a backdrop to their new reality. Samuel looked out toward the horizon, his hands relaxing at his sides. Ji-eun took a slow, steady breath, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. They did not touch, yet the connection between them was absolute. With a final, silent look at the Seoul Tower, they turned away from the ledge. They walked toward the stairwell, moving with a calm, deliberate grace. The stairwell door clicked shut behind them, muffling the wind. They descended the concrete steps, the sound of their boots echoing in the narrow shaft. When they reached the ground floor, the heavy steel door pushed open to reveal the morning pulse of Seoul. The streets were alive with the movement of commuters and the sharp, metallic tang of exhaust. Samuel stepped onto the pavement, his pace steady, his eyes scanning the architecture of the buildings rather than the shadows of the alleys. Ji-eun followed, her stride light and purposeful. They reached the corner where their paths diverged. A bus roared past, its brakes screeching, momentarily separating them with a wall of steel and glass. When the vehicle cleared, the space between them was empty. Samuel turned toward the district where he would begin his firm, his hands moving as if tracing blueprints in the air. Ji-eun walked in the opposite direction, disappearing into the flow of the morning crowd with a calm, unhurried gait. No one looked twice. No one recognized the faces that had dominated the news cycles. The city had swallowed their history, leaving only the quiet reality of two people who had survived the storm. The morning sun climbed higher, washing the gray concrete in a pale, warm glow. Samuel stopped at the corner of a quiet street, his hand resting briefly against the rough texture of a brick wall. He felt the solid weight of the structure, the potential of the space, and the absence of the constant, gnawing fear. He took a deep breath, the air smelling of roasted coffee and damp pavement. A few blocks away, Ji-eun turned into a small park, her pace slowing as she found a wooden bench. There were no cameras, no flashing lights, and no demands. The noise of the city continued, a chaotic symphony. They were no longer the subjects of a public tragedy, but two individuals breathing in the quiet rhythm of an ordinary Tuesday. The story of the taxi driver and the actress had dissolved, leaving behind only the silence of two lives reclaimed. The sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the pavement where the taxi had once idled. That space was now occupied by a delivery truck, its engine humming a steady, rhythmic tune that blended into the urban landscape. The memory of the chase, the fear, and the desperate flight had been scrubbed clean by the relentless movement of the city. Samuel sat at a desk in a small, sun-drenched office, his fingers tracing the lines of a blueprint. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and precise. He looked out the window, watching the traffic flow below, no longer a driver navigating the labyrinth, but an architect shaping the environment. Across the river, Ji-eun walked along the embankment, the wind pulling at her hair. She stopped to watch the water, the surface shimmering with the reflection of the midday light. She did not look back. There were no ghosts following her, no contracts binding her, and no cameras waiting to capture her movement. The evening light began to stretch across the rooftops, painting the city in shades of amber and deep violet. High above the bustling streets, the Seoul Tower stood as a silent witness to the transformation below. Samuel folded his blueprints, the edges crisp and clean, and placed them into a drawer. He stood by the glass, watching the first streetlights flicker to life, their glow steady and rhythmic. He did not look for a taxi. He did not check the rearview mirror. He simply watched the horizon. Miles away, near the edge of the river, Ji-eun stood on a bridge, her hands resting on the cold metal railing. She watched the current pull the water toward the sea, a constant motion that mirrored the shedding of her past. The city lights blurred into a single, soft glow, marking the end of the long road. The night deepened, wrapping the city in a velvet stillness that felt entirely new. Samuel turned off the office lights, leaving the room in darkness save for the faint glow of the street lamps filtering through the glass. He walked to the door, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor, a sound of deliberate progress rather than flight. There was no urgency in his movements, no need to scan the shadows for threats. He stepped out into the cool night air, breathing in the scent of rain and concrete. Across the city, the river continued its steady, rhythmic flow toward the horizon, unbothered by the lives that had briefly intersected upon its banks. Ji-yoon stood on a balcony, watching the distant skyline, the lights shimmering like embers in the dark. She felt the weight of the past dissolve into the vast, indifferent expanse of the night. They had navigated the labyrinth, survived the collapse of their worlds, and emerged as architects of their own silence. The city was vast, the future was unwritten, and for the first time, the path ahead belonged entirely to them. The long journey had reached its final, quiet destination. The city pulse slowed, the frantic pace of the day yielding to the steady, rhythmic hum of the deep night. Samuel stood at the edge of the rooftop, watching the distant glow of the Seoul tower pierce the darkness. He felt the cool air against his skin, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the studio he had once called home. There was no residue of the chase, no lingering shadow of the agency, only the vast, open expanse of the sky. He turned away from the ledge, his movements measured and calm, and stepped toward the stairwell. Somewhere across the sprawling grid of streets, Ji-yoon walked through a quiet park, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. She stopped near a fountain, watching the water catch the moonlight, a simple, persistent motion that required no performance. The city lights continued to burn, vast and indifferent, as they moved forward into the silence of their own lives. The long road had finally come to rest. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the Seoul tower in shades of soft gold and pale violet. Samuel stood on the rooftop, his hands resting on the cold metal railing, watching the city wake up beneath him. The streets below, once a maze of traps and pursuit, now looked like a simple, manageable grid. He felt the warmth of the rising sun against his face, a steady, grounding sensation that replaced the lingering cold of the past. Ji-yoon stood a few paces away, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the morning mist was beginning to lift. She did not look back at the shadows they had left behind. There was no need for conversation. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a bridge. Samuel took a deep breath, the air crisp and clean, and finally turned toward the exit. He walked toward the door, his pace steady and purposeful. Ji-yoon followed, her movements light, unburdened. They stepped into the stairwell, the sound of the heavy door clicking shut, sealing the chapter. The rooftop was empty now, the metal railing still holding the fading warmth of the morning sun. Far below, the city traffic began its rhythmic roar, a sound that no longer signaled danger but the simple, relentless motion of life. Samuel moved through the streets with a different intent, his mind already tracing the lines of structures that prioritize shelter and stability. He walked past the alleyways where he had once driven in desperation, seeing them now as spaces that could be redesigned and reclaimed. He found a quiet corner to sketch, his hands steady, the lines firm against the paper. Across the city, in a neighborhood where the nameplates were small and the crowds were thin, Ji-eun walked into a bookstore. She chose a seat by the window, hidden by the stacks, and opened a book, her focus absolute. No cameras followed her. The city moved on, indifferent and vast. But for them, the labyrinth had finally been replaced by an open road. Years later, the office Samuel built stood as a testament to the lessons learned in the dark. The structure utilized natural light to eliminate hidden corners, a design choice born from the necessity of finding safety when none existed. People walked through the halls he drafted, unaware of the history embedded in the foundation, yet they felt the intentional calm of the space. It was a quiet success, built without fanfare or public recognition. In a distant part of the city, the rhythm of a life lived in anonymity continued. The choices they made to walk away, to build, to disappear, had become their new reality. There were no more sirens, no more pursuit, only the steady passage of time. They had transformed their trauma into a blueprint for a life defined by autonomy. The city, once a labyrinth that threatened to consume them, had become a backdrop for their individual growth. They remained bound by the memory of the struggle, but they were no longer defined by it. The story of the taxi driver and the actress had faded into the background noise of the metropolis, leaving behind only the quiet, enduring truth of their survival. They had reached the end of the chase, and in the silence that followed, they found exactly what they had been searching for all along: a place to belong. The city lights flicker in the distance, a sprawling grid of millions of lives, each moving in its own orbit. Samuel sits at his drafting table, the pencil moving with a steady, practiced rhythm that echoes the stability he has finally secured. He does not look back at the streets he once navigated in fear. The blueprints under his hand represent a new kind of permanence, a structure designed for clarity and safety. Miles away, in a quiet library, the pages of a book turn with a soft, rhythmic sound. There is no need for masks or disguises here. The silence is not a void to be filled, but a space to be inhabited. They are two separate points on a map, no longer intersecting, yet both anchored by the same fundamental truth of their survival. The chase that once defined their existence has dissolved into the mundane, steady pulse of a life lived on their own terms. They do not need to speak to know that the danger is gone. The labyrinth has been dismantled, stone by stone, replaced by the simple, quiet reality of an ordinary day. They have reached the end of the road, and in the stillness that remains, they finally possess the one thing they fought for: the freedom to exist without being seen, and the power to build a life that belongs entirely to them. If you love powerful, real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel.